Good evening or good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to our fourth and final of our historical argumentation webinar series. We're going to do things just a little bit different this evening, and our hope is to set you up not only for finishing up those plans, but also to give you some tips and tricks as you're working with your students this year, kind of as they're working on their History Day products and then polishing them up and getting them ready for whether that's the regional contest to move up to an affiliate contest or even the national contest where we hope to see you in June. Before we get started, huge thank you to our friends at the Library of Congress and the Teaching with Primary Sources Consortium for making this program possible and working to expand it to include so many of our teachers from so many of our affiliates. All right, couple things. You know how it starts, housekeeping. You got the Q&A box. Krista's in charge. Drop those questions in there. We'll answer them. And like always, we'll stay at the end to answer anything that you've got. Make sure to do the survey at the end. That's how we give you your credit. We'll drop the slides and supporting materials on Google Classroom in the morning. All right, what's left? We are so close. We are almost done this course. So the last step is to turn in your revised final argumentation plan. Now, there's a trick to this, so please hang with me. Don't go into the peer comments and start resolving them. That really makes it hard for your facilitators to give proper credit for peer comments. Instead, what we want you to do is take the plan that your facilitator has commented on, make a copy of it, whether you make a copy in your Google Drive or download a copy. Either way is fine. Then what you can do is decide what are the comments you're going to take, what you're going to resolve, what you're going to change, and then what you want to integrate from your peers. You're going to upload that by Friday the 15th, and do us a favor, watch the video we have posted. We want to make sure that what you upload and link to your facilitator really is the correct version and not like the old version with their comments in or the first draft that you did. If you're going to do the revisions, we want to make sure to get the full credit. From there, there is a survey. The survey is due by the 20th, and we ask that you complete the survey after you submit your final plan. This is a combination of NHD feedback, but also some very specific questions to the Library of Congress that's really important for our grant. So if you would please just give us, it's going to be taking about 10 minutes. Give us about 10 minutes, knock out the survey. That is kind of like a webinar. We have to manually update that. So just be patient with us. We'll all get in and start doing it once we get closer to the 20th. Like every day I'll do an update, but realize it's not going to automatically update on your grade. And then Krista and I will be reaching out to you regarding thank you notes for the sponsors. Depending on where you are, your thank you note will go to someone slightly different. So we'll get that organized and reach out, but we really do appreciate your time doing that. So what happens at the end? If you chose the grad credit option, we have to turn in the grades to the University of San Diego, and they will mail you a transcript to your home address. Two things about that. If you have moved since August, please shoot me a note tomorrow with your new address so that I update it in their system and it doesn't get caught up in a mail forward. Second thing to remember about that, if you have to turn in a sealed transcript to your school for credit, don't open the mail. It'll come very clearly from the University of San Diego, but just do yourself a favor on that one. If you chose the PD certificate option, actually all of your certificates are printed and sitting in the program's office at NHD. So as soon as the final grades come through, we sort and we'll drop those in the mail. So same thing, if you've moved from your home address since August, please let us know so that we get it to the right person. Finally, we started to get some questions like, hey, can I use this? Can I share this? Can I share the organizer? Can I share part of these videos? The answer is share whatever you'd like. Nothing we're doing here is secret. And our goal is to improve what's going on in your classroom, in your colleagues' classroom, in your district's classroom. So please do share as much as you'd like. All right, I'm going to pause there and turn things over to Christopher. He's going to jump in and talk about organizing an argument. And then from there, we're going to jump in with some specific writing tips to help you as you clean and polish your work. So, Christopher, thanks for joining us tonight.
Great. I'm so glad to see you guys. And you can see my screen. You can hear me fine?
All
Great.
good.
So we'll just jump back in. The whole thrust of what we've done, starting all the way back in August and September, is talking about historical interpretation and historical argument. And especially last webinar, we started focusing on claims and evidentiary support. And we talked about better and worse historical arguments and what makes something more or less successful. The entire webinar has been about this transformation of raw material, primary sources, into a finished product. And tonight's webinar, like the third webinar, is really going to focus on the finished product. So we talked a little bit in webinar 3 about the difference between descriptive writing and analytical writing and gave some definitions. We also looked at some examples. This paragraph strikes me as very descriptive in that it's giving kind of verifiable factual information that we could confirm in primary sources. This version takes that factual information and says something a little more analytic about it, and therefore something a little more interesting. It takes Washington's height and it attributes particular qualities to it. Then we had Lynn's fantastic description of argument, reasoning, and evidence triangles. Tonight, we're going to do more with thinking about arguments and particularly about organization visually. I find that super helpful for my students and also really helpful for me when I'm thinking about my own writing. So I'm going to give a lot of writing advice and organizational advice that I've learned the hard way through trial and error. And a lot of it is going to focus around visualizing things. So here, imagine we're working with a 3-page essay. It doesn't matter what any of these actual sentences say. We're just trying to think about where things map out visually, which can be a really useful way to conceptualize a short essay. A couple of things that I have learned and have to relearn all the time about writing and organizing. First is that, the skills of writing and of reading feel very different, I think, to most of us, and probably even more dramatically different to your students. Just about every student that I've encountered at every level, from middle school all the way up to senior officers at the Army War College, is much more confident in their skills as a reader than they are in their skills as a writer. Writing can be really intimidating. It's scary to sit down in front of a blank screen. And I think it's useful to remember that these are not so much two separate skills as the same skill captured at different moments. And what we're really talking about is the transmission of information and the creation of persuasion. And writing and reading are really just that same process captured in different instances. And that means what you know about reading can apply to your writing, and what you know about writing can apply to your reading. I have to remind my students all the time that they are on the same team with their reader, and that a really good writer, like a really good quarterback, is trying to anticipate where the receiver is going to be and trying to think enough ahead that they can put the ball where the receiver is most likely to get it. And I think thinking about writing and reading as the same activity in different phases can really open up some very useful practical insights. The other thing I have to remind my students, particularly those who are feeling intimidated about starting, is that our goal in historical argumentation is not to make great art. If you sit down thinking that you have to build a beautiful sculpture like the Pieta here, well, of course you're going to be intimidated. You think, my goodness, how do I put all of this together? Great art is one thing, but really successful historical argumentation doesn't have to be great art. We're making tables here, and a table is something that anyone can make with practice. And a table has a certain set of characteristics, a criterion. There's some flexibility. It might have 4 legs or 5. It might have a round top or a rectangular top. But we're all sort of familiar with the basic characteristics of a good, sturdy table, right? It bears weight. It doesn't teeter. It collapses only if it's designed to be collapsible. And unlike making a beautiful, brilliant sculpture, I'm absolutely persuaded at this point in my career that anyone can learn how to build a good weight-bearing table. And that's really what my advice about organization is going to revolve around. Just a set of basic principles of using your space as a writer in ways that are going to make it easiest for your reader to understand and be persuaded by what you have to say. So, got a standard 3-page essay. It's got 6 or 7 paragraphs, 750 words, not unlike the kind of exercise that our students find themselves doing pretty regularly. And I want to think a little bit about those 3 pages as real estate. There's a finite amount of space to work with, and it is not all created equal. That is, some of the real estate is extremely valuable, and then some of it is a little bit more pedestrian. So in any essay, whether it's 3 pages or 10 pages or 150 pages, you've got some incredibly valuable beachfront property, and then you've got some, useful but not quite as valuable real estate, and that's where you might want to build your strip mall or your Jiffy Lube. And it's very useful for student writers to be tuned into the idea that not all of the space in their essay is created equal. You want to understand what the high value real estate is so that you can make sure you put your most important material there. So if we're looking visually at a 3-page essay, where is the beachfront property? What is the most high value real estate? And I think we can think in terms of prioritization. So the most valuable real estate in any essay, the introduction, it's tinted here in gold. That first paragraph or that first few paragraphs are the most precious resource you have because there's such a finite amount of space there. And your first paragraph needs to have the most important material of the entire essay. All right, where is the other valuable real estate? Well, I think most of you in the webinar would argue, and I would agree, that the topic sentences, that is the first sentence of every paragraph, are the next most valuable real estate. And that's because the topic sentence is sort of a miniature introduction to each paragraph. So we've got some very valuable space there. We want to make sure that we use it carefully and that we make informed decisions about what goes there. Things get a little more debatable after that. At this point in my career, I would say that the next most valuable real estate is the last sentence of every paragraph, called the transition sentence. And we'll talk about what goes there in a moment. And you never want to overlook the conclusion, which is important, but I think maybe not quite as important as some of the things that go on in the body of the essay in terms of persuading your reader. So we're going to talk about these 4 places in an essay and talk specifically about what can go there that will help the reader best grasp and be persuaded by what the writer is trying to argue. All right, so let's go to the introduction first. Like, it's the most valuable thing in the essay because you only get one of them. What goes there? Well, at this point, I like to talk to my students about using the introduction as a roadmap. You're giving the reader a sense of where the essay is going to go and what sort of stops they're going to make along the way. It prepares your reader for the kind of argument you're going to make and the kind of evidence that you will show them as they navigate through the next, half dozen paragraphs. So let's pull some examples out. I went into the Library of Congress archives, as I often do, and I found a great set of sources for my own World War II students. These are the self-published newspapers in the internment camps that held Japanese American citizens from 1942 until the end of World War II. So when the federal government relocated all of these citizens into the interior of the country and put them in these concentration camps. There are kind of daily and weekly newspapers. I thought that was a really cool source. So we're gonna talk a little bit about the end of the war, and some use as our examples just some kind of stock paragraphs about the atomic bombing. So let's take a first quick look at a draft paragraph here. The United States dropped the second atomic device on the Japanese city of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. The bomb was carried by a B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay. The blast killed about 80,000 Japanese in the city. 9 days after the bombing, Japan agreed to surrender terms. Now, there's nothing grammatically wrong with this paragraph, and there's nothing historically inaccurate about it. Everything that I'm going to show you is both historically accurate and grammatically correct. But as a reader, this doesn't give me a great sense of what is coming next. I'm not quite sure what the argument of this essay is going to be or what kind of evidence it's going to show me. There's one sentence that says something more interesting a little bit. This is factually based, but it looks like a kind of cause and effect statement of the kinds that we've glimpsed at in the first 3 webinars, that 9 days after the bombing, Japan agreed to surrender terms, which is a kind of cause and effect. Because of this, another thing happened. But it's not really clear there. It sort of slides in a cause and effect and asks the reader to just accept it. So let's use that as a sort of first crack at an introduction. And let's replace it with this version, which covers the same event, but in a slightly different way. Though Japan surrendered 10 days after the bombing of Hiroshima, ending the war quickly was not the Americans' only goal in using the atomic bomb. They also wanted to show Stalin that they had successfully built such a weapon, to demonstrate its massive destructive power, and to show their willingness to use it. Okay, now, as a reader, I have a much better sense of where the essay that is going to unfold out of this introduction is going. And let's blow it up for a second and kind of see what's going on here visually. We've got 3 separate ideas about what the Americans were trying to achieve in using the atomic bomb at Hiroshima. And I've tinted them in red, in green, and in blue. And as a reader now, I have a sense of 3 things that the essay is going to offer me and support with evidence. That's the roadmap, right? I now know what we're going to see and the order in which we're going to see it and how all the pieces fit together before I've even made my way into the body of the essay. I have an idea about what is coming. And if we're looking visually at this representation of the essay, here's the introduction, that paragraph, which has told me what's coming and given me a roadmap. And now I can kind of expect there's going to be a few paragraphs on the red idea, a few paragraphs on the green idea, and a few paragraphs on the blue idea. That matches up with what the introduction has offered me. And now I've got a good sense of synced up expectations about what I am going to encounter as a reader. The golden roadmap paragraph is telling me to expect these things, and I know what I'm getting into. Now, what if I get into the essay and I get something about showing Stalin that they had built the weapon, but then something about the Americans' willingness to use it, and then reference to its massive destructive power? Now, as a reader, I'm a little confused. What the roadmap told me to expect and what I actually got don't match up perfectly. When your reader's confused, they're expending a little extra energy that you, as a writer, you don't want them to be expending, because any energy that they're expending trying to figure out how you've organized your ideas is energy that they're not dedicating to the process of being persuaded by your ideas. This is an easy problem to fix, and most of you who have taught writing can imagine how to do it. And there are 2 really easy ways. So one is to just change the order in your introduction. You can change the terms that you list or the order you list the terms in your roadmap. and make sure that they match up to what the body of your essay offers. Or you can go in using cut and paste, and you can simply flip-flop those two sections. Neither solution is better or worse than the other. It's highly subjective and highly dependent on what you're writing. The key thing is that what you say you're going to cover in the introduction and what you actually cover in the body match up. We're building a table, just has to bear weight, it has to be level. None of that kind of tippy shake. We're not making great art. We're just making sure that what we promise the reader and what we deliver the reader match up. Okay, so that's my sort of theory about good introductions. Let's talk a little bit about topic sentences, which are, after the introduction, I think the most valuable real estate in any essay. And part of the reason that we spent so much of the third webinar talking about the difference between descriptive writing and analytical writing is so that you could diagnose and focus on the two different kinds. Topic sentences, this is where you want to put your analytical writing, right? You don't want to put facts in your topic sentences on their own. You want to make sure your reader understands what the facts mean in terms of a bigger argument. So here's a potential topic sentence. The atomic bomb dropped at 8:15 a.m. and exploded with the force of 16 kilotons of TNT. That's a fact, but it doesn't really tell me much about what's coming next. Here's a sentence that has a little more heft to it. The American decision to drop the bomb on Japan was motivated in large part by the need to show Joseph Stalin that the US had successfully built a fission weapon. All right, that's not just descriptive writing. It's analysis that makes a claim. And I think that's a much more successful topic sentence because it gives readers a sense of what this paragraph is going to be about. And then you can back that up with some descriptive writing. There is a huge place for description in history, but here it's being used as evidence. These are facts and details that support the analytical claim that is anchoring the paragraph in the topic sentence. And now we get back to this last detail, which kind of brings everything back together. And that's a nice, tidy little paragraph, right? It has a topic sentence that makes an analytical claim. It has some factual, descriptive detail that helps guide the reader through why this is an open question, and then settles it in its last sentence. That's a nice, effective, argumentative paragraph. You string 6 or 7 of those together, and you've got a very solid, sturdy 3-page essay. So you have one paragraph, a next topic sentence that opens your reader into a new idea. And the next trick is kind of making the paragraphs link together in a coherent chain. Here we've got a topic sentence. Here we've got a topic sentence. But the jump between the information about the 8:15 a.m. detonation and its force and the next sentence is a little abrupt, right? And this is the function of the topic sentences that you can see here tinted in light blue to guide your reader from one idea that is in one paragraph and ease them into the next idea. One of the most valuable pieces of writing advice that I ever got revolved around a way to imagine those transition sentences. And my boss at the UNC Writing Center in Chapel Hill said a really good transition sentence needs to be like a hinge. And an effective hinge to work needs to be attached to both panels, right? To the door and to the wall. And in this case, an effective hinge needs to be attached to the paragraph that it's wrapping up and to the paragraph that it's introducing. So what goes in that blank space to guide us, to guide our readers into the new idea? I came up with this just in thinking about a hinge. It needs to have a connection to the idea in the preceding paragraph. It needs to have a connection to the next topic sentence that I've written. And that struck me as a pretty good link, a pretty good way to pull the paragraphs together so that we're not getting 6 separate, unrelated ideas. It's probably important to pause here and to remind ourselves, and especially to remind our students, that this requires a lot of effort, and nobody, and I mean nobody, gets it on the first try. I love to use this Library of Congress source. It's the original handwritten draft of the Declaration of Independence. And the reason I love this is you can see all the emendations, the cross-outs and the suggestions and the additions. And I tell my students, Thomas Jefferson needed an editor and a couple of drafts. You need an editor and a couple of drafts. And really good writers build in time to do this. I have been writing and working with writers and working with people who are very smart and very good at expressing themselves for my entire adult life. And I have met exactly one person who's capable of sitting down and doing all of this on the first pass. And all of the other people I've met, which include best-selling authors and prize-winning historians, they give themselves many drafts. You don't expect to do all this on the first pass. My students often get a paper back from me and they see that I've crossed out 2 or 3 things, and they come back and they say, how on earth do you expect me to go back and do this? Nobody goes over their writing with this much detail. Well, here's an example of a chapter that I was working on last spring. This is like my 4th draft, and you can see I've written all over it, crossing things out, moving things around. I don't expect all of my students to do this carefully on everything that they turn in, but this is how good writers get towards better organized essays, is they build in time in the process to make revisions and to make changes. Nobody falls into this perfect arrangement and really sensible organization on the first try or just haphazardly. It requires a little bit of work to move things around and to get them so that the reader flows right through the ideas without expending a lot of energy trying to figure out what the writer is trying to say. Okay, let's take a look at that last piece of real estate, which I've shaded here in kind of royal blue, the conclusion. This is the part of the essay that most of my students seem to struggle with the most. Your students may be the same way. I get a lot of conclusions that read like this. This essay discussed the reasons for the US use of the atomic bomb against Japan. It argued that ending the war quickly was not Americans' only goal in using the bomb. They also want blah, blah, blah. I think this is a product of an old piece of writing advice that a good essay tells the reader what you're going to tell them, and then tells them, and then tells you what you told them, tells them what you told them. And in a 3-page essay, as a reader, most of us don't need to have a sort of blow-by-blow recap of the thing that we just read. Our attention spans aren't that bad. And so this, to me, is not a great use of that valuable piece of space in the conclusion. So what does go there? For I think most people who are writing history, the conclusion is a great place to take a stab at the bigger question, which is always, so what? Let's assume that I have been persuaded by the argument in the introduction and that is developed with evidence in the body of the essay. What does that mean for my understanding of history or some chapter in the past or some phenomenon? And that's challenging to answer, and it requires often some brainstorming, but there are ways to do that, ways to answer the so what question by thinking about what new doors this research opens or what kinds of questions it might lead to. So I took one crack at answering the so what question here, that most Americans think of the decision to drop the bomb as a quicker way to end the war without invading Japan. Understanding how planners took Stalin's response into account changes the way we think about the end of the Second World War and the beginning of the Cold War. And that might develop into a few more sentences in the paragraph, but it is not simply rehashing what the essay has already said. Or we could do something slightly different, but still in the service of the so what question. Understanding that ending the war quickly was not American planners' only goal alters how we think about the decision to use the bomb. Knowing that it was as much a diplomatic decision as an attempt to save American lives changes the way we view the 80,000 Japanese civilians killed in the blast. We're asking a bigger question, a so what question, and offering the reader some sort of bigger window into what this particular argument might tell us about the past. Okay, that's a quick overview of my kind of approach to visually organizing ideas. It's not uncommon for people to email me after this webinar and say, well, I'm sure this works great with your senior undergraduates, but I teach middle school, and this all seems like it would be difficult to translate into my classroom. And I've actually had the great privilege of going and watching some master teachers at every level teach. And I can tell you, I've seen this work at every level, although it's, usually at a slightly more age-appropriate version. So let's take a look at what that might look like, again, using a great Library of Congress source, Paul Revere's engraving of the Boston Massacre. This is very much like what I think you could expect out of like a 7th grader. Here's an early draft of the introduction. Paul Revere made this engraving in April 1770. It shows the Boston Massacre. British troops are firing into a crowd of innocent colonists. Paul Revere himself was not present at the event. And you can kind of recognize some of the patterns, right? A lot of descriptive writing here, not a lot of analysis, a lot of telling readers verifiable facts, but not explaining what the significance of those facts are. But here's a slightly revised version dealing with the same source that does some more interesting things. Paul Revere made this engraving of the Boston Massacre to get colonists mad at the British. Revere was not present at the event, but he shows it in a way to make people see the British as evil. The redcoats are in a line, which makes it look like a firing squad. There's an officer giving an order, which shows that the massacre was not an accident. And none of the colonists are threatening the British, which makes it seem as though they are innocent victims. And those are all insights that are available, to a middle school student who spends some time with the source. And the thing about this paragraph is it's got a roadmap. We have an idea as readers of where the evidence and the arguments are going to unfold and the order in which they're going to unfold. It's the same basic principle applied to historical insights that are maybe not quite as advanced or quite as subtle as you might expect out of an AP US history class. But the principle of explaining to the reader where you're going and making sure they have a good sense of what's coming and in what order, that doesn't change. Do the pieces match up? Do they appear in the order that you've promised them in the roadmap? You got a good sturdy table. A good sturdy table is a good sturdy table by almost any definition, right? It has a couple of characteristics that we can all agree on. All right, my favorite part. Let's test your ability to kind of see what's going on. And what I'm going to do is we'll do 3 tonight. We'll throw in a freebie for the holidays. Grab some stuff from Library of Congress. I've been teaching World War II, and we're getting into the post-war era, so I spent some time falling down the rabbit hole of the interstate highway system. And we're going to do an exercise that my students have taken to referring to jokingly as the optometrist exercise. So I'm going to give you 2 versions here of a short introductory paragraph that might serve as the opening of an essay about the interstate highway system. And let me give you the first one. A is the interstate highway system began a large new building program in 1956. President Dwight Eisenhower was a champion of the interstate highway system. Today, the system has nearly 50,000 miles of roads. The longest highway is I-90. So that's option A. Here's option B. The interstate highway system was the most successful federal program of the 20th century. It made long-distance travel more convenient, but it did more than that. It solidified the nation's Cold War defense, and the economic connections it fostered added to the country's prosperity. All right. My students call this the optometrist exercise because I give you both, and then you just say, which is better, A or B? Do you like A or B? Can you see clearly through A or B? Which do you think does a better job of showing the reader what the argument is going to be and how it's going to be organized? Take it away, Lynn.
All right. Polls are going. We've got about 70% of you responding. Go ahead and put those final answers in. Let's see what the audience says.
I can't see the voting on this.
I can see it. It's kind of fun. The bars
No,
move
I
across. All right.
should be able to watch
This was a
little
pretty
bars.
clear one. 95% for B, 5% for A.
All right. I think B does work better. And let's talk about why. A has some factual information, but doesn't really tell me what the paper is going to be about, except that it's going to tell me things about the interstate highway system. B does make some more analytical claims about cause and effect. And it also gives us a pretty clear roadmap, right? We've got three things that the essay might develop. First, that the interstate highway system made long distance travel more convenient, but that it did other things too, that it solidified Cold War defense, and that it created economic prosperity. Now I've got an idea as a reader about what this author is trying to persuade me of. I think that's a pretty good thumbnail introduction. Let's do another one. One of my summertime rabbit holes, dropping down to the Library of Congress and learning a little bit more about the Apollo programs. Let's do the same exercise. Here's A. The 1967 Apollo 1 mission ended in disaster when fire killed 3 astronauts during a rehearsal. It was a major setback for the American space program. It shook public faith in NASA. It revealed serious flaws in the safety check program, and it led to congressional investigations in the House and the Senate. All right, that's A. Here's B. The tragic death of 3 Apollo 1 astronauts in 1967 turned out to be an important step forward for the space program. It revealed flaws in the safety checklist that were fixed in later Apollo missions. It encouraged engineers to pay more attention to cabin pressure issues. And it solidified public determination to make it to the moon to vindicate the sacrifice of the Apollo 1 astronauts. Same optometrist deal. Which do you like? Do you like A or do you like B?
We're responding a little faster this time. We've got the hang of it.
Everybody's quick on the buzzer. Good. That's why we love this group.
Go ahead, put your answer in.
It's one of many reasons. It's one of many reasons.
Oh, this is not a blowout. This is an interesting one.
Not a blowout.
All right, last 3 seconds. Ready?
Right.
Set.
I can
All right,
hear
I'm gonna
people
go
out there struggling, like the finger on the trigger button.
All right, the results are 22% went for option A, 78% went for option B. So option B,
Interesting.
but by a much smaller margin.
All right, let's take a look at option A for a second. I think option A works pretty well as an introductory paragraph. It is making an argument that the Apollo 1 mission was a major setback, and then it's giving us that roadmap, right? Red, blue, and green ideas about shaking public faith in NASA, revealing flaws in the safety check program, and leading to congressional investigations. And all that's hitched to this idea that the Apollo 1 mission was a setback. So if you picked option A, congratulations. That's a really good introductory paragraph. What about option B? Option B seems to work pretty well too. Option B is arguing that the same exact event turned out to be a step forward. It's given us the same 3 things, that this flaws in the safety checklist were fixed later, that this encouraged engineers in an important way, and that it solidified public determination. So I think B works really well as an introductory paragraph too. So if you picked B, give yourself full credit as well. Both of these work pretty well. The thing that I would point out is that they are making dramatically different arguments. One of them says that the Apollo 1 mission was a major setback. The other argues that the Apollo 1 mission was an important and necessary step forward. So I'm not picking out, one of these arguments as being the right one. I'm just pointing out that both of them introduce their logic and the kind of evidence they're going to use in a really organized, easy to follow way. All right. Play one more? Why not? It's almost Christmas.
Wait, there could be more than one right answer? Let's have fun.
Oh yeah. See what I did there? We're mixing things up here at webinar 4, right? There's not simply one right answer. Both of those I think work really well. Big music fan, and I got interested a few months ago in kind of revisiting the Rolling Stones concert at Altamont, which is kind of famous or infamous. And let's talk about why, and let's do the same exercise one more time. All right. Option A. The 1970 documentary Gimme Shelter covers the Rolling Stones' infamous free concert at Altamont. The show ended in tragedy through no fault of the band. The crowd was just too large for the venue. As the day went on, the crowd and the security forces became more antagonistic. The 3 deaths at the show were unforeseeable. All right, that's A. Let's take a look at B. The 1970 documentary Gimme Shelter covers the Rolling Stones' infamous free concert at Altamont. The show ended in an entirely predictable tragedy. The free show drew a crowd that was much too large. The band hired the Hells Angels as security rather than professional guards, and they paid the Angels in beer. No one should have been surprised late that night when drunken Hells Angels stabbed a concert goer. All right, you guys know the drill. It's the optometrist. Which do you like better, A or B? Which do you like better, A or B? Are they going faster this time, Lynn, or?
We had some fast early responses, but there's some people thinking about it, so we'll give you another second.
Yes,
But again,
the
go with your
sound of
best
hard,
choice.
critical thinking.
Let's go. Last answers. Go for it. Go for it. 3, 2, 1. All right. Oh, this is an interesting one.
Oh
44%
man,
went for option A, 56% for B. That's really close.
That's about as close. That's probably the closest one we've had. Let's break them down and see why. I think option A works pretty well. It's giving us a sort of 3 claims that the body of the essay can back up with evidence. The crowd was too large for the venue, the security forces and the crowd became antagonistic, and that you couldn't really foresee this outcome. That's a pretty good introduction. As a reader, I have a pretty good idea where things are going. If you picked A, way to go. That's a correct answer. What about B? I think B's doing pretty good too. It's giving us 3 points: that the free show drew a crowd that was too large, that hiring the Hells Angels as security was probably a bad idea, and that nobody should have been surprised. And as a reader, I have a pretty good idea where this argument is going to go to and how it's going to be organized. Like the Apollo essay, it's, I think, worth pausing to note that these are radically different arguments. Like the first essay is making a case that nobody is to blame, and the second is making a case that there is very specific blame to be apportioned. But it is possible to write either of those arguments in a good, well-organized way that brings logic and evidence and presents it in a way that the reader knows what's coming and can follow it. So that's what I got. Let me hand things off to Lynn, and I will be sitting here.
All righty. Well, thank you so much, Christopher. We appreciate that. If you can go ahead and just stop your screen share so that I can jump on, that would be great. First thing we wanted to do is share a piece of feedback that came out of a couple of our sections. And one of the things that I think is important, and I think is a trend that we've seen in history over the last few years, is that the language and the way that we're talking about history, particularly about people in history, has shifted. So while these tips are really more specifically directed at some of our teachers who are working on Kansas-Nebraska Act arguments, we want to throw it out there because we think it can have a lot of practical application for your teaching, for your History Day students, and for any kind of reading and writing that you're doing moving forward. So we wanted to throw a couple notes out. One of the things that we like to talk about here at History Day is precision language, and we're working on some new resources that'll be coming out this spring. One of the big shifts, and I know that the books on my shelf don't use this terminology, but that the new books are. It's important that we're shifting from using the term slave to using the term enslaved person, enslaved workers, enslaved women, enslaved children. And that's really important because when you use the term slave, you're putting all of humanity into a category that was put on people. It's also really important as you're writing, if you use the term Black to describe a person, we want to make sure that we put a capital B, so Black t-shirt, lowercase, Black voter, uppercase. We're using it as an adjective to describe people. That's important. similar with African American women or African American leaders. One thing that comes out sometimes is the reference to the term freedman. It's important that that's a reference to the Freedmen's Bureau, not a group of people. Another shift that's happening more and more is the question of whether to describe people as, let's say, African American men versus Black men. And that's a trend that's being continuing discussed. Black, in the past, it was more, it could be a 50-50 split. Black is tending to be a little more in favor right now, but either can be used. It's important, though, that we're using so and doing things in a respectful way. One thing I think we want to check all of our writing, all of our students' writing on, is that number one, we're talking about somebody, especially who's alive today, we speak about people the way they'd like to be spoken about. So, think about how are they talking about themselves. We want to be really careful to avoid the use of collective nouns, where we categorize a group of people only because of their race. And we've got to be really careful with derogatory language when we're describing and analyzing. We know that depending on the topic you or your students are studying, it's going to be there in the primary sources. We can't take it out. I don't think we should take it out. But I do think that when we analyze it or describe it, we make the choice to not repeat and empower those words. Sometimes it's required to be used once, you have to make a point with it. However, I think if you absolutely need to, and that's a big if, you want to put that term in quotation marks. And as you analyze or describe, do not repeat that word. It's a good reminder that while our languages and our best practices in history will change over time, the primary sources don't. All right. I thought we'd wrap with a little bit of a top 10 list. I love teaching writing and I love editing, and a big part of our job at History Day involves an awful lot of editing. So we put together a list of top 10 editing tips that can help you, but also I think can really help your students. All right, 10 things that I think you want to remember anytime you're turning in a written product. Number one, my fourth grade teacher, Mrs. McMahon, was right. Spelling and grammar do count. It's important that spelling and grammar doesn't take over writing, but if you're turning in something that you've had time to polish, it's important to double check everything. I used to tell my students that they were waiting for like a sign from up above in order to make edits to their writing. And sometimes those little red squiggly lines, that's your sign. Remember that. All right. I'm going to put a reference from one of my favorite movies of all time. There is no I in history. There is no we in history, just like there's no crying in baseball. A lot of times people want to write, I think that Thomas Jefferson, blank, 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 blank. There's no I. If students are in a group project, we think that. No. The argument that you're making is your argument or our argument. Drop the I's, drop the we's, unless it's in a direct quote. It probably shouldn't appear in a History Day project. All right, like Christopher was talking about with the hinges earlier, signposts are your friend. And again, Christopher was using the example of an essay, but keep in mind when you're working with History Day students, the roadmap of that essay is the same as laying out a documentary or an exhibit or the script for a performance, signaling to your audience that you're going to change from one idea to another or move forward in time. There's nothing wrong with that. All right, number 7. Know your medium and adjust accordingly. In more traditional styles of writing, like our NHG paper writers, paragraphs tend to be anywhere 4 to 6, maybe even 7 sentences long. But if they're writing for a website, oftentimes website paragraphs are 1 to 3 sentences long. It's a different medium and helps students adjust, right? Because putting a paper on a website really doesn't make a good website. It just makes the paper on a website. Number 6, this is the biggest thing, and it takes a little bit of time, but man, is it worth it. Read something out loud. When you have written and edited and revised, one of the things we talk about at History Day is we try really hard to have somebody else. We say, I'm ready for clean eyes. And when we're really getting close to something that's really important, one of the things we try to do is to say, okay, you haven't worked on this, read it to me. That's where you're going to catch missing words. That's a big problem that I have. My brain puts the little words in there, but it's also going to help you hear the sound and the flow. If you're somebody who has trouble with run-on sentences, When the reader's trying to read a run-on sentence to you, oftentimes they lose breath and they have to stop, breathe in, and keep going. That might be a sign that your sentence is just a little bit too long. All right, number 5, like we've been talking about in the last webinar, analyze, analyze, analyze. Oftentimes when we have that analysis to description balance, we tip on the side of description because we like to tell the stories, but make sure that analysis is coming through. All right, we love historians here at History Day. I don't know, you might have heard of one of them. His book's right behind me on the shelf. We love historians like Elizabeth Cobb and Christopher Hamner, but it's really important. Do not let them speak for you. Sometimes we see a student will, wrap up their exhibit and it'll say conclusion. David Kennedy said, quote, and it's like, no. I love Dr. Kennedy, but Dr. Kennedy isn't writing your conclusion. You're writing your conclusion. So make sure to pull that student voice through and don't rely on those historians. Remember, they're amazing. They're secondary sources. They have amazing place and a very important place in the research process, but don't let them draw your conclusions or create your arguments. Number 3 is my personal favorite. History already happened, and it happened in the past, so we've got to make sure our verbs stay in the past. Number 2, less is more. Oftentimes students, especially as they're getting from that middle school to high school transition, start to do what I call kitchen sinking. They start to write a lot, especially when they can type fast, and they start to write and hope that if they put enough in here, especially on like a short answer question on a test, you'll find enough in there to give them, 4 out of 5 points, or at least most of the credit. But honestly, helping your students condense their words and tighten their words often makes all of us better writers. So do exercises where they have to answer something in 200 words and then say, can you cut out 25 words? Can you cut out another 25? Can you get your point across with less? One of the joys of History Day word counts and time limits. It's really about improving the process. All right, my number 1 tip. Get rid of the passive voice. Go with those past tense, but active verbs. We see lots of sentences that are things like President John Quincy Adams had served as the American ambassador to Imperial Russia. Totally true. But a simple way to transform your writing is to think about subjects, verbs, and objects, especially when you're tight on time. It's going to help to make your message clearer. So one of the things that oftentimes you say, okay, do we need the helping verbs? Can we just say President Adams served? Oh, wait, we can. That saves a word. Another way to think about it, can we restructure the sentence? Is the important part that he served as the ambassador? Or is the important point that he, the former ambassador to Russia, supported a particular law or an initiative? So think about that. One trick that I like to do with students when they think they have something written is to take a highlighter and highlight all the verbs and say, hey, who can cut out 2 words? Who can cut out 3 words? Who can cut out 4 words? We're not changing your meaning. That's not usually the point of editing, right? It's about making it tighter, easier to read, and easier to understand. If you're like, hey, this would be helpful to my classroom, we've got a handout, you can print it up, make it a poster. I've got to be clear. These are tips, not rules. That's why we call them Lynn's tips, right? They're not rules. If I say it's a rule, then that means you can't compete with a project with passive voice. And trust me, you can. That's not a rule. Your rule says things like your documentary is limited at 10 minutes. But the editing tips are things that you can use and apply in your classroom. And you know how this works. Your students might not listen to you. Maybe they'll listen to me. So it's worth giving it a shot. We'll drop this in the webinar form materials again tomorrow. All right. That means we are going to go ahead and come to our final Q&A session. Really quick, before we get into this, take a minute, write it down. You know this. It's the same one as every time. tinyurl.com/NHD-HAWS Historical Argumentation Webinar Series 24. Simple, but it's important. We use that feedback. We evaluate it not just to work for the next program, but also we compile all that data into a final report, and we'll sit down as a team and go through, okay, what worked? What didn't? What do we want to tweak? What do we want to improve? We're hoping to continue this program for a few more years with new teachers. So all of your feedback is very, very valuable. And please know that we truly do look at it and read it and care about it. So it's really important to us. All right, this is your time. What questions do you have? Do you have questions about tonight's presentation, about the final assignment, about History Day in general, about Christopher's next book project? If you want to know, this is your chance to find out. So let's see, Krista, do we have anything in the queue or anything from earlier?
We do.
All right, let's go.
We have a couple of questions. This is for you, Christopher. Some questions about stylistic writing choices. You began a couple sentences with "and." Can you describe
Yeah, I do that.
why you
And
made that choice?
That is a kind of just a habit of mine that is maybe bad, but it got through the style guide of my editor. And so that was not how I was taught to write in high school, but I like sentences sparingly that begin with "and" or "but," because they kind of hammer home a point. So it might be kind of bending a grammatical rule, but I think it works. It drives some people crazy. And if it drives you crazy, don't write that way. The other two things I use a semicolon a lot, like way, way, way too much. And I use the double dash a lot, also way, way, way too much. Some of these things are like little writing bits that are, they're personal, like your fingerprint. And I think that it's good to know the rules. And then in very certain cases, if you're a teacher with a lot of experience, like giving yourself the freedom to break the rules every once in a while. Miles Davis said something like that about the rules of musical theory. Like you had to know them inside and out. And once you knew them inside and out, you had the freedom to break them on occasion. But with my students, I'm much more severe, and I come down with the hammer a lot about grammatical choices.
Can I throw out an idea from someone who does a lot of editing? Sometimes that stuff is good. If you're using it 3, 4, 5 times in a paragraph, it's not. Like I was doing an editing piece and there were like, I think there were 4 M dashes in a sentence or 3 of them. Too many. And I think the key is like with the semicolons, it can work sometimes. It can be really effective. But if you're doing it all the time, sometimes that's a good sign that some of these ideas are 2 separate ideas and maybe we should break them into separate sentences or separate paragraphs. And I think the other thing I think we don't think about with writing is the importance of giving it a little time. And sometimes we don't have the luxury of time. Trust me, I understand that. But when you can take writing and put it away for a couple days or a couple weeks, when you come back to it, you will see things. I can tell you, we'll work with content here and then we'll think we've got it really well edited. And then we send it off to our graphic designer who lays it out and it'll come back like the first draft of the theme book or a new lesson resource book. And I can't tell you how many editing conversations we have. We're like, what in the world were we thinking? How did we miss that phrase? How did we miss that we didn't cut those extra 2 sentences out? And I think that that's really important. I also think having people look at your work who don't know anything about it, who maybe haven't participated in the creation, I think those are all really good tips because they're going to see it differently. And I think the hard part about that is we tend to get a little attached to our writing and we tend to think that it's all good. And it's hard to be like, wait, somebody doesn't like what I said. They don't understand it. But again, they're not doing this to put you down. They're doing it to help you. So think about that as you're working and think about just a little bit of empathy because your students are doing this all the time when they're turning in their writing to you. So keep that in mind from both sides of the spectrum.
The editor that they assigned me at my publisher said that things like semicolons and double dashes and starting sentences, the conjunctions, and whatever, your kind of personal thing is, the editor said that that was like cayenne pepper. Like it was a useful thing, but very sparing. And, that you wanted to use it very carefully and not very much. And said, Hamner, you've got like a whole chapter that's mostly cayenne pepper here. Like that's not going to be particularly delicious. And when I started using Lynn's advice about reading things out loud, that kind of cued me into the fact that, especially with like the semicolon or the double dash, it's like these are long, complicated sentences and they don't all need to be this long. They're hard to read. And I'm asking my reader to do a lot of extra work that I probably ought to be doing as the writer.
And we don't want to lose the reader, right? We want them to follow along with us.
Want to put the football where the receiver can make the play.
I want to emphasize a point that you were saying, Lynn, about the benefit or the luxury of time. Certainly, you can see things that you missed, but something that has surprised me in my own writing, with giving it a little bit of time, is how frequently I think, oh, that's not as bad as I thought it was. I was so wrung out by the process of writing it that I am surprised and delighted at what I had written. And I think, don't often give enough space for that possibility.
So,
Okay.
let's see, what other questions do we have? And don't forget, get that survey in. I know it's clogging up my email. I can just see it and feel it.
Here is a question about how to treat the conclusion. In what circumstances is it a good idea to end with a call to action?
I would say I think it depends what your goal is, right? I think sometimes it is. I think sometimes we want to end with an advocacy, like, hey, we want the reader to do something.
Yeah.
But I think it doesn't always work out that way. It's kind of like when we talk about History Day projects and we talk about, short-term and long-term impacts. We want to pull them forward in history. That doesn't mean they always come all the way to 2023. It's okay to look at Apollo and focus your efforts on how that made an impact in the 1960s, 70s, and early 80s and stop there. And again, it depends on the story, depends on what you're trying to pull through. But you don't have to go, well, Apollo 1 happened and then we're launching SpaceX. We don't have to go all the way there, because depending on what your focus is, that's not always needed.
Okay. We have a couple more questions.
Okay.
This is about the assignment that's due. I have a handful of questions about that. First question about that. Is it permissible to use sources that we discovered while peer editing from our classmates?
Can you revise your argument based on what you've learned? 100% yes. That's part of the point of peer editing and putting sources into discussion boards. Now, I will say, if you're going to pull another source, you have to write your own original interpretation, right? You've got to write those two sentences that helps connect it to your argument, and you got to make sure it connects to your argument. But using a source that somebody else found is okay, as long as you're providing your interpretation. Now, if you copy and paste somebody's entire argument, that's not okay, right? Because then you're taking somebody else's ideas and intellectual property. But pulling a source and then going, oh, this newspaper article really helps my case, go for it.
Okay, another question about taking feedback, or a different kind of question about taking feedback from this last assignment. What should folks do if they're getting contrasting feedback from their reviewers?
I think you have to sit and stop and look. Ultimately, you have to make the decision. And if you're looking at it, sometimes there's a clear, like, yeah, I don't agree with that one. I'm not going to go there. That's fine. You're the author. You're going to make the choice. If you're struggling and saying, well, I could sort of see it this way, but I could sort of see it that way, my suggestion, ask, right? Maybe pop by office hours, shoot a quick email. Now, mind you, the deadline's the 15th. Please don't wait till 11:30 p.m. on the 15th to ask us a question. But we've got a good solid week and a half. We're happy to answer questions. We've got 2 office hour blocks set up. But we also have time. If you're like, hey, I'm not sure, but can I pop on Wednesday morning? Shoot Krista an email. We will coordinate between your facilitator, between Krista, between me, between Christopher. Heck, I'll pull in Dr. Gorn if we have to get through the week next week. We will get somebody to sit down and look at it with you and help you. But ultimately, I'm never going to tell you what you have to do, right? I can give you my suggestions, but it's ultimately your choice because this is your intellectual product.
Here's a question that I think gets to the heart of balancing description and analysis. So when using a source, do the writers need to explain it because the reader will not be able to click on the source and see it for themselves? Generally, how in-depth or how brief should a description of a particular source be?
Christopher, why don't you hit on that one?
I'll take that because that's like right at the heart of how I spend my working days.
Mhm.
You do need to offer a short thumbnail description or explanation of the source, because in most essays, the reader can't just kind of click on it and look at it. My advice to my students at every level is to try to keep that explanation and description as brief as possible, and to be guided by what you're using that source for. It's very easy for students, I think I do this too, to say, boy, I don't want to do the hard thinking for analysis, so let me just go into a long description of this source and where it came from and what it looks like. And in general, I think you want to limit yourself to the bare bones of what a reader who's not familiar with that source needs to know about it to understand the way that you're using it. And so you don't need to include every single detail about it. You don't need to quote every single paragraph and every single passage. You want to focus on the things about that source that are relevant to the way that you're going to use it. And so I try to go back in my own writing, and when I'm advising students, to write up your little description and then go back and kind of pare it back or prune it back. Did this detail that I include, is it in a concrete way important to their understanding, or is it just a kind of fun, interesting detail? And for the most part, I think you want to just tell them what they absolutely need to know about the thing that you're using, so they can understand the way that you're introducing it as evidence. You might think about this like a courtroom. You're going to introduce a piece of evidence or an exhibit. The attorney can say all sorts of things about it, but really they want to focus like, this is what you need to know about this thing to understand how it fits into my persuasive argument that this person is not guilty. It's fine to explain, but I think try to keep that very brief, because remember, anytime you're doing description or explanation, you're not doing analysis, and analysis is really where we go to, earn money in historical writing. So you're adjusting that rheostat kind of away from the thing that we really want to focus on.
Okay, we have a question that's more about resources from the course. And I think it's just a good reminder for everyone to know that the recording of this webinar, if there's something that you want to look back and refresh your memory on something, this will be available starting tomorrow morning. Lynn will post it up on the Google Classroom site. And along with that, under the heading Webinar for Materials, you will be able to see the slides. So we have someone interested in looking at the slides, and just a reminder for all of us that the slides will be available.
It takes about an hour for it to process on YouTube once I get it up to YouTube, but by mid-morning, it'll be there.
Someone wants to know, Christopher, where's your metaphor machine? How do you come up with your good metaphors?
The good ones I stole from somebody else. The bad ones I came up with off the top of my head, and it's pretty common in class. I'll hear myself make an analogy, and I'll be like, "Oh, that didn't work." But I think I've been kind of collecting analogies. I think as most teachers do. This is a lot like this. Think of this like this other thing. I think analogies are useful for students and for audiences, and I think the process of kind of coming up with something that this is like is useful for me as an instructor. But if there's one that really made sense, almost 100% certainty that I borrowed that from somebody else.
Okay, I'm just looking at one that came in. A question about when to cite sources, especially if we reference it for the first time. Any general tips for practices on when and how to cite?
Well, I would say we're looking from a History Day project point of view. Sometimes I see this, especially with paper writers. Sometimes they get very excited and cite every single sentence in their paragraph or in their paper. And a lot of times it's like they cite the source and then they cite it again and again and again. So one thing that I think is important is to help them distinguish between quoting and paraphrasing. To decide, obviously, if there's a direct quotation, there's got to be a clear footnote at the end of the sentence. But sometimes you might have, especially with paraphrase work, 2, 3, 4, 5 sentences, and putting either the parenthetical citation or the footnote at the end of that sequence signals to the reader like, oh, all of this stuff comes from, let's say we're describing Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. You can describe it and analyze it and then cite it once at the end. But it's important to make sure you're distinguishing between the information you're citing and you're not citing your analysis. Again, like we talked about, don't let historians speak for you. Don't let Christopher speak for you. Make your argument about Revolutionary War soldiers. You can pull facts from his book and use that, or you can pull a primary source and use that for information. But don't let his conclusion become your conclusion. And we see, I think sometimes we see underciting or oversighting. I think sometimes, if you're citing every single sentence, that's way too much. If you're going 2, 3 paragraphs without a citation, that's probably too little. So think about the just right and in the middle. And that's a great question once students have a draft to ask other students. Or sometimes often our coordinators can be really good sounding boards for students because they look at lots and lots of projects every year. One thing I will mention, because I know sometimes people ask us, Krista and I are not allowed to look at History Day projects and give feedback. As much as fun as that would be, that's the only thing we would do, and it runs the risk of doing unfair advantages. So as much as you may be like, hey, I've got this great website, will you guys take a look at it? We're not allowed to. We could actually lose our jobs over that. So when we say no, please understand it's not about you.
Someone's night was made by the University of Michigan reference.
I threw that in for Lynn. Lynn, the Penn State fan. I just wanted to give her a little Tom Brady to send her home.
I can live with Michigan, and as long as he doesn't do Ohio State, we're okay. He can, we can work together again.
We're fine there. I would rather.
Sometimes the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? Especially in the Big Ten.
I think we are set right now. I'm typing a last typed response to a question about the contest, but I think we have all webinar related questions addressed unless someone is typing a question in right now.
Great. Well, if you are, go ahead and keep typing. What we're going to pause and say, thank you very much. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your energy. Thank you for doing this when you have lots of other things going on. I truly hope, and we truly hope, that what we've done is given you some new tools, some new strategies, some different ways to look at things. And I'm hoping you can take something out of here, whether it's through the research skills, the argumentation skills, or the polishing and writing skills. Because I think the more we improve our skills as teacher, the better we get at something, the better we have the ability to coach our students to get better at things. And we are incredibly grateful to the team at the Library of Congress for making this happen, providing the funding, and also, and not just for this course on this time, but for multiple years to help us develop the teacher guide, develop other supporting materials, and share this with, there are now over 400 teachers across the country and around the world who've taken this course. So congratulate yourself for getting to the end. And you're this close to being an alum of the program. So congratulations and cheers to that.
I just want to echo Lynn's thanks. We're really grateful to the Library of Congress for all their support. I'm really grateful to National History Day to be brought on as part of the team, but mostly we're all really grateful to you guys for making the time to do this. We know how busy you are, especially in December, and hopefully you got some things that you can use in your classroom and with your own teaching practice. We're just really glad that you decided to spend part of your fall with us.
Lots of messages of thanks coming through right now. It's been a
Excellent.
great
Well,
learning opportunity. Yeah. Lots of thank yous.
Wonderful. Well, we appreciate it. We know that you appreciate it. So thank you very much. Have yourselves a wonderful evening. Look for the video and materials tomorrow. And we're almost there. Let's race to the end. Have a great night, everybody.